بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. All praises are due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May His choicest salutations and blessings be upon His most beloved, our master and our leader Sayyiduna Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all the favors that Allah has granted us. But more specifically, we thank Allah ta'ala for the favor of Iman and Islam. This is indeed a great favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had bestowed upon us. Inshallah, over the next 3 weeks, there will be a series in which we will be speaking about how Islam entered into South Africa. And this will culminate with the annual Jalsa for Madrasa Nahrul Haya, the Madrasa of this Musalla, on the 2nd of December, insha'Allah ta'ala. And my task is to speak about how Islam entered into South Africa in the 17th century. This is a very interesting history, which is our history as South Africans. But before we talk about the history in South Africa, let us give some context and put some perspective to where it all began, insha'Allah ta'ala. So around the 15th century, this was when the Ottomans took over and they became the dominant Muslim rule at that time. And we know that the Ottomans were predominantly Hanafis in madhab. They used to follow the Hanafi school of thought. That's why right up till recently, majority of the world is Hanafis, because the last empire that we had before, 100 years ago, was a Hanafi madhab. However, in Yemen, there was the Shafi'i madhab, and the Yemenis at that time used to do a lot of trade around the world. So they went to East Africa, in that place where they used to do trade. They went to certain parts of India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka. They used to do trade there. And the Yemenis were predominantly the Shafi'i madhab. They used to follow the Shafi'i school of thought. So all those areas, East Africa, as well as those Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, they all started adopting the Shafi'i madhab because of the tradesmen that would come into their areas and interact with the people and so forth, right? So we keep that in our mind. That was such a great thing in Islam, but at the same time, the Muslims were losing Andalus, which was known as Spain, Portugal at that time. It was coming out of Islamic rule. And the last city that the Muslims lost to the Christians was the city of Granada. Now at that time, what used to happen was, the Europeans, when they wanted to trade with Southeast Asia, they had to pass through the Middle East. But because there was beef with the Muslims at that time, they decided that let's take a different route to Southeast Asia. And the Europeans were very backward. But because of Muslim rule in Spain, Allah Ta'ala had made it such that they learned a lot of skills from the Muslims. They learned how to build ships, how to build vessels. And the Muslims were navigators. They used to navigate and assist the Europeans to navigate through the sea. So a person very famously known by the name of Vasco da Gama was the first person who left the shores of Portugal. He was Portuguese of origin actually. And he went to Southeast Asia, but they took the route past the Cape of Good Hope. And his navigator was an Arab Muslim called Ahmad Majid. So anyways, they went into Southeast Asia. Their objective was to trade, but the main objective was actually to colonize, to take over those areas. So the colonizing started taking place. And we know how bad was the colonization and so forth. So the Dutch came and they colonized this area of Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka and so forth. And there was great resistance from those people. But what happened was, in the 17th century, the Dutch set up a colony in Cape Town. It was a halfway mark for them from Europe to Southeast Asia. And in this colony was where they brought many prisoners, political exiles, and free people to this colony of Cape Town. And this is how Islam actually came into Cape Town. Right? And the Muslims of Cape Town, because the Yemenis had went into Indonesia and so forth, and they were of the Shafi'i madhab, we know that the Muslims of Cape Town now started adopting the Shafi'i school of thought and the Shafi'i madhab. Right? So let's speak a bit of the timeline of events, and then we'll speak about the main influencer amongst the Muslims in Cape Town that was towards the end of the 17th century. So in the year 1652, so 1600 to 1700 CE, Common Era, was known as the 17th century, right? So in the 1652, this was half of the 17th century. It is said that a few Malays from Batania were brought to the Cape. Then in 1654, which is 2 years later, the Dutch East India Company, that was the company that was traveling from Europe to Southeast India, Southeast Asia, they made the Cape as their midpoint between Europe and Asia. And in the year 1656, because certain people were preaching against the Dutch colonization, they exiled them. 4 people from Batania, they exiled them. 3 of them they took to Mauritius, and 1 they brought to Cape Town. So it is said that this was the first Muslim that came to Cape Town in the year 1666, right? And they came on a vessel called the Hassel. Right. 2 years later, the year 1658, Jan van Riebeeck was now in Cape Town. So he requested that some laborers be brought to Cape Town. Right? They were known as the Maardekers. Maardeker actually meant someone that was free. So they were not, what we would say, they were not slaves. They were free people that came into Cape Town. And their job was to provide labor, as they were doing in Indonesia, and all those places around amongst the Dutch rule. And they were also brought to fight or to resist against the indigenous people that were found in Cape Town, which was the Khoi and the San at that time. So that's why the Maardekers were brought, right? These Maardekers that came, they were from an Indonesian island called Emboina, right? They were not allowed to practice Islam freely, but they could convert to Christianity. So there was a person who wrote a rule that if they wanted to practice, they had to practice quietly in their homes. They could not practice freely. However, if someone wanted to accept Christianity, then this was allowed for them. Right? But up till this point, Islam never spread a lot amongst the Cape. Right now in the year 1667, so this is about 10 years later. Right, we're still in the 17th century. Now the political exiles started coming to Cape Town. They were known as Orang Kayen, the political exiles. Now if you understand, Indonesia, Malaysia at that time had small kingdoms found within among the different islands and so forth. Right? So if a king was vocal against the Dutch, they would exile him to Cape Town. Cape Town was known as like the Guantanamo Bay. No one would ever come to this part of the earth. It was right south. No one would come to Cape Town. So they would exile them. So the first political exiles that came were the rulers of Sumatra. They were Sheikh Abdul Rahman Matahi Shah and Sheikh Mahmud. They are buried today in Constantia in Cape Town. Right? Then in the year 1681, it became Dutch law that all political exiles must be banished to Cape Town. So many Macassarian princes came. They were housed in the stables of Castle of Good Hope. And they were kings in Indonesia, but when they came to Cape Town, their influence amongst the Malay and Indonesian community was very little, these people, in 1681. Right now, the main political figure that came to Cape Town, and we will speak a lot about him inshallah, is Shaykh Yusuf of Macassar. We famously know him as Shaykh Yusuf of Macassar. His name was Abidin Talib Jusuf. Right? He was born in Goa, near the East Indies somewhere. And Shaykh Yusuf, in the year 1644, Right? So we're going a bit back in history. He left Indonesia and he went to study in Makkatul Mukarramah and Madinatul Munawwara. His main teacher was a sheikh by the name of Shaykh Ibrahim al-Kurdi. Shaykh Ibrahim al-Kurdi taught him the sciences of hadith. When he went back to Indonesia, he found that the Dutch had colonized Indonesia and the situation became bad. So he decided to make jihad against the Dutch. He was escaping them. Eventually they said that we will pardon you in the year 1684. They said, we will pardon you, hand yourself over to us. He handed himself over and obviously they lied. So they exiled him to Ceylon. Ceylon presently today is Sri Lanka. That time it was known as Ceylon. I think the city of Sri Lanka is called Ceylon today. So they exiled him there. But Sri Lanka was still too close. It was still in Asia. So he was sending letters, he was writing books, and he was stirring the jihad against the Dutch. Eventually they said, let us send him to our Guantanamo Bay. So in the year 1694, towards the end of the 17th century, Shaykh Yusuf of Macassar came to Cape Town. Now the political exiles, let us understand one thing. Although it was difficult there to leave their homes, but when they came to Cape Town, some of them were respected. They housed them well, they looked after them, they just wanted them to be far away from their colonized places. Shaykh Yusuf came to Cape Town on a boat called a footboot with 49 people. Amongst them was his 2 wives, 2 slave girls. There were his 12 children and there were 12 imams that came. He was welcomed by the governor called Simon van der Stel. They didn't want him to stay in Cape Town because of his influence, so they banished him to a place called Zandvliet. It was a farm that belonged to Dominic Petrus, right? Which was about 40 kilometers from Cape Town. And this was on the mouth of the Eerste River, right? From this place, this is where Islam spread in Cape Town. Shaykh Yusuf, they thought they put him far away. All the political prisoners, all the slaves would come and they would learn the deen from Shaykh Yusuf. And he had his 12 imams of them. And they learned how to even make wudu and ghusl because they were right by the river, the Eerste River that was there. Right? Now today, this place is known as Macassar. Zandvliet in Cape Town is known as Macassar because Shaykh Yusuf was from Macassar in Indonesia. Right? Now Shaykh Yusuf learned by Shaykh Ibrahim al-Kurdi. And this is very special for us as the subcontinent or the Indian community in South Africa. Because we also link to Shaykh Ibrahim al-Kurdi. And I'll tell you how. I, Ridwaan Bavaddin, I studied hadith by my Ustad Maulana Mansur al-Haq, who was from Pakistan. Maulana Mansur al-Haq studied hadith from Allama Yusuf bin Nori rahmatullah alayhi, who was first in India and then went to Pakistan. Allama Yusuf bin Nori rahmatullah alayhi studied hadith by Maulana Anwar Shah Kashmiri, who was based in India. Maulana Anwar Shah Kashmiri studied hadith by Maulana Hazrat Shaykh al-Hind rahmatullah alayhi, who fought against the British. Shaykh al-Hind studied hadith from Maulana Qasim Nanotwi rahmatullah alayhi, who was the founder of the famous Darul Ulum Deoband. Maulana Qasim Nanotwi studied hadith from Shah Abdul Ghani al-Mujaddidi, who studied hadith from Shah Ishaq al-Dahlawi. At that time, the whole part was known as the subcontinent, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. Shah Ishaq al-Dahlawi studied hadith from Shah Abdul Aziz al-Dahlawi. Shah Abdul Aziz al-Dahlawi studied hadith from his father, who was Shah Waliullah Muhaddith Dahlawi. Shah Waliullah was the person who brought hadith to India or to the subcontinent. Where did he learn hadith? He studied hadith in Madinatul Munawwara under the same Shaykh Ibrahim al-Kurdi, who was the Ustad of Shaykh Yusuf of Macassar. So they both studied under the same teacher. Right? Shaykh Yusuf of Macassar was an alim, so we know he taught the people of deen. But he was also a Sufi. A Sufi is a person who involves himself in the dhikr of Allah, who focuses on the cleaning of the heart, as well as has some practices or cultural practices which they bring into Sufism, although if they love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they love for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Yes, if it goes overboard, then it becomes bid'ah. But Shaykh Yusuf studied under a Sufi from Yemen. His name was Imam Abdullah Al-Alawi Al-Haddad. Right? In fact, Shaykh Imam Al-Haddad mentions Shaykh Yusuf of Macassar, that he met him in Taiz, and he mentions him in his book Nasailul Ulwiya fi Masail Al-Sufiyya. And he says that Shaykh Yusuf was Rajulun min Jawa, Yusuf, huwa min ashabina. He was very close to this Imam Alawi Al-Haddad. Shaykh Yusuf read the book of Ibn al-Arabi to the Shaykh who was blind, and the Shaykh was a Sufi. Now, we know, especially amongst the Cape Townians or the Malay community, they have a common practice which is known as the Ratibul Khaddad. This is where it came from. Imam Abdullah Al-Alawi Al-Haddad wrote a book called the Ratib, wherein included the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And his name was Haddad. So the Cape Townians, they say Ratibul Khaddad. And later on, what they did is some cultural practices, like I told you. So now they use swords where they cut themselves, they burn some incense, and so forth. As part of the practices, what the Ratibul Khaddad. So this is what the Sufis would do. Also, another common thing that came about was that of Rampis, or Rampis Nei, or Rampis Ni, which they call it. What the Cape Townians would do is the ladies would gather in a masjid, they would cut orange peels, they would dress in clothing called the Madura or Mudiarang, which is like a colorful clothing some people they have to buy for the ladies from Hajj. They would cut the orange peels on the 12th of Rabiul Awal or before that and speak about the seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is some of the cultural practices that the Sufis or Imam that came from Shaykh Yusuf of Macassar, and these practices were brought into Cape Town. I got 2 minutes left, inshallah. So Shaykh Yusuf was only in Cape Town for 5 years, from the year 1694 till the year 1699, and then he passed away. And he was the first person who brought Islam into Cape Town. Inshallah, next week the speaker will speak about the 18th century and then the 19th century. Shaykh Yusuf of Macassar, there's a difference of opinion whether his body is buried in Macassar, because today we have that kramat, as they call it, or the tomb of Shaykh Yusuf. Some say that his body has been taken to Indonesia. Now, they were respected. Shaykh Yusuf was respected. So, about 3 years after he passed away, there was a request from the people of Indonesia. They sent his family back. He was the problem. You have sent him away, send his family back to Indonesia. So the Dutch, they were stingy people, right? So they said, we'll send some of the women and some of the children. But we had to house Shaykh Yusuf for 5 years. There was an expense for that. So all the other male family members of his must work to pay off however much it costed us to house Shaykh Yusuf, and then they can go back to Indonesia. Right? So this is the history of Islam in the 17th century in South Africa. Look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan. Allah ta'ala's plan is amazing. We think colonization and all of these things, they thought that they could own the world and do whatever they want, but Allah ta'ala's plan was that Islam must come to South Africa. And subhanallah, Islam had flourished in South Africa. This is indeed a great favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah ta'ala to give us an understanding. Wa akhiru da'wana, alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.